When any great power decides to project dominance into the Middle East, the first question serious analysts ask is never whether that power can win the early battles. It almost certainly will. The opening phase almost always looks decisive and clean. Armies advance rapidly, governments collapse under military pressure, flags change over official buildings, and the early coverage celebrates what appears to be a swift victory. Generals give confident briefings. Politicians claim vindication. Supporters point to falling statues and declare that history has turned. But that is precisely the moment when the real war begins, because the visible war and the actual war are two entirely different conflicts happening in two entirely different arenas. Before the occupation officially begins, before the reconstruction contracts are signed, before the diplomatic debates about exit strategies even start, the trap has already been fully set. It was set by geography, by centuries of layered history, by the deep internal structure of every society the invader is about to enter and has never truly or honestly understood from the outside. Because the Middle East has not simply resisted foreign domination across its long and layered history. It has systematically consumed it. Every empire that entered this region believing it carried superior firepower, superior organization, and superior will eventually discovered something deeply uncomfortable. The region does not defeat invaders on the battlefield. It defeats them everywhere else, in the economics, in the politics, in the slow psychological erosion of soldiers who cannot tell friend from enemy, in the endless cycle of retaliation that makes every tactical victory feel hollow and every strategic goal feel permanently out of reach. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern. And understanding why that pattern keeps repeating itself generation after generation is far more important than debating the outcome of any single military campaign. Start with the oldest trap, the one that empires almost never recognize until they are already deep inside it. The Middle East is not a single problem waiting for a single solution. It is an extraordinarily complex web of overlapping loyalties, ancient grievances, religious identities, tribal structures, and competing nationalisms layered on top of each other for centuries. When a foreign power enters this environment and attempts to impose order, it immediately makes enemies it did not anticipate, allies it cannot trust, and commitments it cannot easily abandon. The British Empire learned this after the First World War, when it drew borders across the region with rulers and pencils, carving up Ottoman territory into artificial states that grouped together populations with deeply conflicting interests and histories. The map looked clean and logical in London. On the ground, it planted seeds of conflict still actively bleeding today more than 100 years later. France made the same fundamental mistake in Syria and Lebanon. The Soviet Union made it in Afghanistan. The United States made it in Iraq. Every foreign power since has walked into the same room and been genuinely surprised by the same furniture that destroyed every previous visitor who entered before them. The details change. The outcome does not. The second trap is geography, and it operates differently here than in most other regions on Earth. The Middle East is not simply a desert, though the desert creates enormous logistical challenges for any occupying force projecting sustained power across vast distances. It is a mosaic of genuinely difficult environments, dense urban centers, with millions of inhabitants packed into close quarters, mountain ranges that channel military movement into predictable and dangerous corridors, river valleys where populations concentrate and effective control demands constant exhausting presence, and vast empty stretches where insurgent forces move freely and vanish before any organized response arrives. Urban warfare in particular represents one of the most costly and unpredictable forms of military engagement ever developed. Cities are not simply places where people live. In a conflict zone, they become three-dimensional battlefields where every building is a potential fortress, every alley a potential kill zone, and every civilian casualty generates new fighters motivated by grief and rage rather than political ideology. The United States discovered this brutally in Fallujah. The Soviets discovered it in Grozny. The Israelis have discovered it repeatedly across multiple campaigns in Gaza. The lesson is always the same, and it never permanently registers in the next round of planning. Urban terrain neutralizes technological superiority completely and hands every advantage to the defender willing to absorb punishment indefinitely and fight from the rubble of their own neighborhoods. Now consider logistics, because no military campaign in the modern era has ever succeeded when its supply lines were consistently threatened. The Middle East presents a uniquely punishing logistical environment For any foreign power operating far from home across extended time frames, every piece of equipment, every round of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every medical supply must travel enormous distances through multiple vulnerable transit points before reaching soldiers in the field. Those supply routes pass through some of the most contested maritime and overland corridors on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz alone represents one of the most critical strategic choke points in the entire global system, carrying a substantial portion of the world's oil supply through a narrow passage that regional powers have repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to threaten and disrupt at will. Any sustained military campaign in the region automatically places those supply lines at serious ongoing risk, and when logistics begin to fail even partially, even the most sophisticated military force starts losing its operational effectiveness far faster than anyone in the optimistic planning stages ever honestly acknowledged. Here is where the political trap opens wide and reveals its full depth. Foreign powers consistently enter the Middle East carrying a theory of victory that depends entirely on local cooperation materializing naturally once the initial military phase concludes. The assumption is always the same regardless of which country is making it or which decade the intervention occurs. Once the existing government is removed, a more cooperative local authority will emerge to fill the vacuum and partner with the invading power in constructing something new and durable that justifies the original decision to intervene. This assumption has been proven catastrophically wrong every single time it has been seriously tested. When Saddam Hussein's government collapsed in 2003, what filled the vacuum was not a grateful democratic Iraqi state eager to align with Washington. What filled the vacuum was brutal sectarian warfare between communities held together by force for decades, now settling generations of accumulated grievances with extraordinary and sustained violence that consumed the country for years. When Gaddafi fell in Libya in 2011, what followed was not peaceful democratic transition. What followed was a fragmented, failed state that became a major transit hub for weapons and armed factions spreading instability across North Africa. The pattern repeats because the underlying reason never changes. Foreign powers cannot manufacture legitimate local authority from outside. Legitimacy grows from within communities over long periods through organic processes that cannot be accelerated or imposed at gunpoint, regardless of how much money, military force, and genuine good intention is applied. Then there is time itself, perhaps the most consistently underestimated factor in every calculation about military intervention in this region. Empires operate on compressed time horizons. Democratic governments operate on even shorter ones defined entirely by election cycles, budget pressures, shifting public priorities, and finite political patience create enormous pressure on leaders to produce visible results within months rather than the decades genuine transformation actually requires. The populations that resist foreign military presence operate inside an entirely different and far more patient framework. They are not fighting to satisfy a domestic audience or win a favorable news cycle. They are fighting because the foreign power is standing on their land, and they are prepared to continue for as long as that condition persists, without any agreed deadline. This asymmetry of time is one of the most powerful and least honestly discussed forces in modern conflict. The Taliban simply waited 20 years while the most capable military force in human history gradually exhausted its political will, then watched everything built during those 2 decades dissolve within days of final departure. That is not simply a military failure. It is a fundamental failure to understand what kind of war was actually being fought from the very beginning. The economic dimension of this trap is quieter but equally destructive when measured honestly over time. The post-September 11 campaigns cost the United States multiple trillions of dollars when long-term expenses are honestly included veteran health care, interest on borrowed funds, equipment replacement, and intelligence operations that never fully end once they begin. That spending produced no stable allied governments, no durable regional security order, and no meaningful reduction in the underlying conditions generating continued instability. Meanwhile, domestic costs accumulated steadily year after year, infrastructure projects deferred indefinitely, social programs chronically underfunded, national debt expanded at historic scale, and the true cost is never just financial. It is measured in the gradual erosion of national credibility, in the slow exhaustion of military readiness, and in the generation of veterans who return carrying wounds that no victory celebration was ever held to acknowledge. A nation that commits multiple trillions and 2 complete decades towards it cannot win does not emerge stronger or more respected. It emerges more divided, more heavily indebted, and significantly less capable of addressing the challenges that actually threaten its long-term security and the welfare of its own population at home. The regional network effect then multiplies every one of these problems beyond original projections. The Middle East is not a collection of isolated and independently manageable states. Every military action sends ripples outward through an interconnected system of relationships, alliances, proxy arrangements, and shared historical grievances stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the borders of South Asia. Striking one actor immediately activates responses from connected actors across the entire network simultaneously. Iran maintains active allied networks in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Turkey pursues strategic ambitions across Syria, Libya, and Muslim communities worldwide. Russia and China hold carefully developed regional stakes and actively complicate any campaign that advances Western interests at their expense. A foreign power entering this environment believing it can address one specific problem without triggering cascading consequences consistently discovers that every action generates multiple new complications it never planned for and actively did not want. There is also a trap operating at the level of intelligence and local knowledge that receives far less serious attention than it deserves. Every sustained military campaign depends on accurate and timely information about enemy movements, local population loyalties, and rapidly shifting political dynamics on the ground. But in the Middle East, that information environment is extraordinarily difficult to navigate reliably over extended periods of time. Local partners who appear cooperative during the early phases of an intervention often maintain hidden parallel loyalties that only become visible when the invading force begins clearly struggling. When local populations start doubting that the foreign power can achieve its stated objectives, the information flow quietly reverses. Convoys get ambushed at their most vulnerable moments. Routes that seemed secure become suddenly fatal. Forward positions face relentless harassment that never fully stops. Soldiers begin feeling that every movement is watched and every decision anticipated in advance. That feeling is frequently and uncomfortably accurate. And once the intelligence environment fully turns hostile, effective operational planning becomes nearly impossible. Regardless of how much surveillance technology and analytical capability the invading force deploys at enormous expense. The final and deepest trap is historical perception itself. When a powerful outside nation deploys forces into the Middle East, regardless of stated justification, it activates a historical memory shared across hundreds of millions of people spanning multiple generations. The memory of colonialism, of borders drawn without consent, of resources extracted and governments installed whenever local choices failed to serve outside strategic interests. This memory does not require active cultivation to remain politically potent. It lives in family stories, school curricula, religious discourse, and the founding narratives of every significant political movement that has emerged from the region across the past century. Once a foreign military presence gets absorbed into that historical narrative, the local population stops evaluating the intervention on its stated merits and begins resisting it as the latest chapter in a much older story. When that shift happens, no development investment, no diplomatic messaging, and no tactical success can reverse the fundamental political reality. The intervention has itself become the central grievance it originally claimed to address. Step back from every individual piece and look at all of these traps working together simultaneously as a single interlocking system rather than a list of separate problems. Geography that channels forces into predictable kill zones, logistics stretched dangerously thin across hostile terrain and contested sea corridors, political vacuums filling with violence rather than cooperative governance, time asymmetry exhausting democratic systems before it exhausts local resistance, economic costs hollowing out the intervening power from within over years and decades, compromised intelligence environments turning local knowledge against the occupying force, regional networks transforming every tactical decision into broader strategic escalation, historical memory converting every military presence into a symbol demanding continued resistance. None of these forces operates independently of the others, and none of them weakens with time. They actively feed into each other, reinforce each other, and compound each other in ways that planners consistently underestimate at the optimistic beginning of every new campaign. The Middle East cannot be won because winning. in the sense that great powers have always imagined it and planned for it and invested in it, was never actually available as a real option on the table. It was always an illusion visible enough to justify the decision to begin, distant enough to keep the commitment alive long after any honest assessment would have ended it. The region operates according to its own internal logic, its own depth of historical time, and its own proven capacity to absorb foreign ambition and return it as prolonged, expensive, and inconclusive conflict. Every empire that entered this space convinced it represented a genuine exception to the established pattern has eventually departed, having confirmed that pattern for the next one waiting behind it. History does not repeat itself because people forget it. It repeats because every new generation of leaders believes, with complete and sometimes remarkable sincerity, that they have finally understood something that every previous leader somehow missed. The trap is not hidden. The history is not classified. The lesson is written plainly in the accumulated experience of every occupation that came before. The only question that has never been adequately answered is why, with complete access to everything that history so clearly teaches, the next great power always steps forward anyway, fully convinced that this time the variables are different, the strategy is finally sound, and the outcome will at last justify everything invested and everything lost right up until the very moment the trap closes completely and irreversibly around it.